fall, we began establishing our new hosta bed by laying out the walkway and establishing some structure. This season, we finished planting out our hostas, and we've started to plant some of our viburnums and hellebores as well. Now, with all of these hostas in one place, I want to pay very careful attention to managing snails and slugs in this garden. These herbivores love to feed on hostas, and they're very similar animals. They're both a type of mollusk. The main difference between the two is that snails have a spiral shell while slugs lack that shell. And they move on a muscular foot and this excretes mucus, and they tend to leave a slime trail behind them. And sometimes we could see that slime trail on our plants or in the garden, and that's one cue that they are present in the landscape. We also often find some of these discarded shells laying around on the soil. And of course, we might see evidence of them feeding by leaving large holes in our leaves. Luckily, we don't have too big of a problem yet, but I want to make sure to control that before it becomes a big problem. Now, snails and slugs tend to hide out under rocks, logs, boards, low-lying branches from trees, or weedy areas around the base of trees. And one way that we can manage these pests is by reducing the number of hiding spaces. Now, of course, we purposefully laid out this nice stone path, which is a great hiding place, but we don't want to remove it. But we could focus some of our management in these areas, in these hiding places. Now, there are many different management techniques that we can use to manage snails and slugs, and in fact, combining a number of these different methods is going to give us the best level of control. So we're going to start with simply hand picking and removing those. So what we want to do is look under some of these sheltering sites, and we're going to see a few other insects and critters that like to hide, like beetles. And we want to locate some snails and simply pick them up and remove them. And we could put them in a bucket of soapy water to kill them. We can also just simply crush them or put them in a Ziploc bag and discard of them in the garbage. Now, another way that we could draw more of them out to manage them is to give the garden a light watering late in the afternoon. And then in the evening, as it starts to get dark, come out with a flashlight and look for the snails and slugs. And at that point, they're going to be more on your plants because they're going to be actively feeding. They tend to come out at night and feed. You want to practice this hand removal about every day as you get started. And then once you notice the population levels dropping, you could check them about once a week. Now, switching to a drip irrigation system in your landscape will reduce the humidity levels in the garden. It'll also keep the foliage dry, and overall we're going to have a less favorable environment for snails and slugs. You can establish some little trapping stations throughout the garden if you've removed all of the hiding places, but you want to look in a few places. Clay pots work really well, or you can invert melon rind. If you're using a pot, put a little stick under it to lift the edge off the ground, and that'll allow the snails and slugs to crawl under there. Then you can check these regularly for hand removal. Many gardeners use beer-baited traps to attract slugs and snails, but the mollusks are actually attracted to the fermentation products, so you don't have to use beer. You could use a combination of sugar water with yeast, anything that'll give that fermentation. And the way these are used is you dig a hole large enough to house a large cup, and you want a cup that has fairly upright sides so that the mollusks can't crawl back out once they're in. And you want to sink this to the level of the soil and go ahead and push it up around it. Now, unfortunately, these aren't the most effective. They only attract slugs and snails within a few foot radius, so you want to get them right in around your plants. You can cover them. I just use little pie tins and landscape stakes. And you could cover them to keep rainfall out, and also in the summertime you're going to have a lot of evaporation. So that'll reduce the evaporation. But for the labor involved, they're not the most effective management tactic, but you can use them. Another way to manage snails and slugs is to establish some type of barrier around your plants, and there's several different types available. The most effective are those that are made out of copper flashing or screening. And the way these are used is you'll dig a trench around your plant. You can also put them around a whole planting bed, and you want to bury the flashing so that several inches extend up above the surface. And it's kind of interesting, the reason that the copper works is it somehow interacts with the foot, the mucus on the foot of the snails and slugs, and causes almost an electric shock, and that repels the insects away and keeps them from crawling in. Another type of barrier is to pile a mound about 3 inches around your plants of ashes, diatomaceous earth, or another abrasive material. However, as these get wet, you need to replenish them, so that can also be very labor intensive. The barrier will prevent snails and slugs from crawling into the area with your plants, but it won't manage any snails or slugs that are already inside. For this, you'll need an alternative method of control. Snail and slug baits are a good option. And there's several different baits available, and the baits alone are not enough to effectively manage snails and slugs, but when we use them in combination with other methods, they can provide better control overall. Now, the baits that use metaldehyde are most common, but these are toxic to dogs and cats as well as children, and the pelleted form of these are often very attractive to dogs. So if you have pets or children and that's a concern, you might want to use an alternative. One of these are baits that use iron phosphate as the active ingredient, and we'll see this labeled in a number of ways. Some of the trade names are escargot or sluggo. These all contain iron phosphate, and they come in a pelleted form, and we want to apply these around the base. We want to sprinkle them. We could sprinkle them in gardens, we could put them in lawns, or around the base of trees if we have problems with slugs in our trees. And it's important that you don't just pile them up like this, because that's going to make them much more attractive to dogs or children who might come and eat them or play with them. So you want to sprinkle them in a broad area. Now, the iron phosphate based pellets are safe to use around edible plants if you have a problem with slugs, like in your lettuce, for example. Now, timing is critical when we're using a bait. Snails and slugs don't feed very much in very hot, dry weather or when it's cool, so these are not ideal times to use a bait. You want to lay them out in the evening or late afternoon or in the morning and irrigate the area before you do so. We also have a number of natural enemies in the garden that feed on snails and slugs. Snakes, toads, ground beetles, birds, these are all wonderful natural enemies. They're not going to manage slugs entirely on their own, but they will contribute to mortality. Also, if you keep chickens or geese, you can let these walk through the area to pick off snails and slugs. They'll feed on those, but you want to be careful because they can scratch up small plants as well. It's most effective if you combine several of these different strategies. That'll help keep your hostas looking beautiful, keep those snails and slugs away.